Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic the ancient Egyptians took very seriously, and sometimes very weirdly: sex. From sacred rituals to surprisingly frank poetry, this civilization was more open, creative, and frankly experimental than most people today might be after 2 glasses of wine and a horoscope reading. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Egyptians didn't treat sex like a scandal. They treated it like plumbing: necessary, functional, and ideally without too many blockages. In ancient Egyptian society, sex wasn't hidden behind closed doors, hushed whispers, or uncomfortable euphemisms. It was part of nature, like the sun rising, the Nile flooding, or cats doing whatever they wanted. The gods did it. The farmers did it. The nobles did it. And crucially, no one felt the need to invent shame about it. The culture didn't frame sexuality as something dirty or dangerous. In fact, it was sacred, tied to creation, fertility, health, and personal pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. This wasn't hedonism. It was balance. Egyptian society ran on the principle of ma'at, cosmic harmony, and sexuality was part of maintaining that harmony. Fertility meant crops. Crops meant food. Food meant survival. So if your sex life was healthy, the gods were probably smiling. If not, well, maybe it was time to light a candle to Hathor and consider using more honey. This open attitude filtered into everything: art, literature, medicine, even architecture. Temples featured carvings of fertility gods. Homes were often built with private areas for intimacy. And yes, ancient architects had enough tact to know that love doesn't flourish next to granaries. And unlike many later societies, ancient Egypt didn't obsess over celibacy or punish people for having sex, unless it involved property disputes or someone else's wife. There were no mass puritanical movements, no complex hierarchies based on who did or didn't do what with whom. Your social value wasn't chained to what you did in bed. It was tied more to how much land you had, how good your grain harvest was, and whether you kept your linen white in the sun. If you're wondering why sex was treated with such casual sacredness in ancient Egypt, you can thank the gods, who, frankly, set the tone by making it part of their divine job descriptions. Let's begin with Atum, the original solo act. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Atum created the world by engaging in an act of, let's say, enthusiastic self-involvement. No partner, no help, just pure determination and cosmic alone time. From this, he produced Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, which means the Egyptian universe literally began with a one-god show and bodily fluids. This wasn't scandalous. It was revered. Atum's generative act was seen as power, a divine assertion that life starts with desire. No need for fig leaves or awkward silence. The gods didn't blush. Why should anyone else? Next up, Osiris and Isis, ancient Egypt's royal couple. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis, determined and very committed, reassembled his body. All of it. Well, almost all. One crucial part was missing. So what did she do? She crafted a substitute phallus, yes, with magic, revived him long enough to conceive Horus, and voila, the divine bloodline continued. That's love. And excellent time management. Then there's Min, the god of fertility and male potency. He was often depicted standing tall, in every sense, crowned with lettuce, holding his most recognizable feature proudly in hand. Ancient statues didn't leave much to the imagination. Shrines to Min featured ritual lettuce offerings, symbolizing fertility. And, well, lettuce was kind of their Viagra. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and drunken joy, was another sensual figure, Often nude or semi-nude in depictions, she represented everything pleasurable about human connection: dancing, desire, laughter, and seduction. Festivals in her honor were essentially ancient tinder with tambourines. Even the sun god Ra had moments of reproductive importance, though usually involving creation through speech or spitting, which is only slightly less weird than Atom's solo performance. The gods modelled sexuality as divine, necessary, and sometimes a little experimental. They didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. They merged them. Not every Egyptian was crafting magical phalluses or offering sacred lettuce to the god of fertility. Most were just normal people with normal relationships, trying to find time for intimacy between feeding the livestock and avoiding crocodiles. Unlike their more dramatic gods and occasionally incestuous royalty, the average Egyptian's love life was pretty down to earth. If you were a farmer, a potter, or a linen worker, chances are your romantic endeavours revolved around who lived nearby, who made good beer, and who still had all their teeth by age 30. Standards, but reasonable. Relationships were built on shared labour, shared meals, and ideally, shared affection. Couples slept in the same bed, raised children together, and even snuck the occasional love note onto a potsherd. Yes, literal shards of pottery with messages like, "I dream of your beauty by night." That's ancient texting, folks. Sex wasn't regulated by priests or political decrees. As long as it was consensual and not interfering with your work or someone else's marriage contract, it was your business. Privacy might have been limited, walls were thin, and nosy neighbours were eternal, but intimacy was respected. For many couples, physical affection wasn't hidden. Tomb paintings sometimes showed husbands and wives touching tenderly, holding hands, or standing face to face, and not in the "this is purely ceremonial" kind of way. These were people who genuinely valued connection. The Egyptians also understood timing. Fertility mattered, a lot. The Nile flooded predictably, crops had seasons, and so did the human body. Women knew their cycles, men had herbal tonics, and everyone had at least one grandmother with unsolicited advice involving honey and onions. Contraception, while not foolproof, was part of life. So was midwifery. There were even pregnancy tests involving barley and emmer seeds. If they sprouted after being peed on, congratulations. If not, maybe next year. And if things didn't work out romantically, divorce was possible. No trials, no public shaming. Just a split of property and a return to separate bread ovens. If you're imagining ancient Egyptian weddings with veils, bouquets, and uncomfortable uncles doing the crocodile dance, you might want to scale it back. A lot. The truth is, in ancient Egypt, getting married was delightfully low effort. All you needed was a house, some bread, and mutual tolerance. A shared bed didn't hurt either. There was no ceremony, no priest, no registry office, no 47-plate catering menu, with chicken, lamb, or divine mystery stew. If two people agreed to live together and shared resources, food, linens, maybe a goat, society accepted them as married. Just like that. Done. No wedding dresses either. Women wore the same linen garments they wore every other day, usually white, sometimes pleated, always breathable. No rings, no vows, no emotional groomsmen with speech scrolls. Ancient Egyptian relationships didn't need pageantry. They needed practicality. You've got chores to do after all. The barley's not going to thresh itself. That said, couples did sometimes write up marriage contracts, especially in later periods. These were basically ancient prenups. Who brings what into the household? Who keeps what if things go sideways? Occasionally, the contracts even spelled out penalties for bad behaviour. If you hit me, you owe me silver. Not quite romantic, but very efficient. The marriage contracts also reinforced women's rights, something ancient Egypt was surprisingly advanced about. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and take ex-husbands to court if they tried anything funny. If love was blind, Egyptian law most definitely wasn't. There wasn't a honeymoon, per se, unless you count collapsing after a big feast and hoping no neighbours overheard the fun. But intimacy, affection, and companionship were clearly valued. Marriage wasn't just a transaction, it was a partnership. Ideally. Let's get this out of the way. Ancient Egyptians valued fidelity, especially in theory. In practice, things were a little more flexible, particularly if you were wealthy, powerful, or had very convincing excuses. Adultery, like many social sins, wasn't always a criminal offense. For everyday folks, it was more of a reputational hazard than a legal disaster. If you got caught cheating, people would talk. Loudly. And probably in verse. But unless someone's livestock or inheritance was directly affected, the government wasn't rushing in to punish your escapades. However, if you were a married woman caught in adultery, the consequences could be harsher, socially and economically, if not legally. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not aggressively so, and a woman's fidelity was often tied to questions of paternity, inheritance, and her general standing as someone who didn't cause chaos during harvest season. Accusations of infidelity could lead to divorce, public shame, and in rare cases, punishment like beatings or banishment, particularly in elite households where family honour was a full-time job. Men, meanwhile, had more wiggle room. A married man sleeping with an unmarried woman? Mostly shrugged off. A married man with another married woman? Now that was messy, especially if the other husband was important and not into sharing. Jealousy has never been confined to any one century. Texts from the New Kingdom mention moral expectations and the importance of a good reputation. In some stories, adulterers are described as foolish or dishonourable, while others suggest that a man who sleeps with another man's wife will have a tragic fate, usually involving curses, impotence, or angry gods with jackal heads. Still, the absence of strict laws against adultery in most periods is telling. The Egyptians didn't feel the need to legislate every affair. They relied more on shame, gossip, and the occasional passive-aggressive song lyric. It worked about as well as you'd expect. If a marriage broke down due to infidelity, the divorce process wasn't overly complicated. Property would be split, and the community would collectively pretend they weren't watching with interest. Children typically stayed with the mother, especially if they were young. If your first reaction to hearing that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters is a horrified, "Wait, what?" You're not alone. Most modern humans respond the same way. But in ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Romantic? Not really. Political? Absolutely. To understand this eyebrow-raising tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your family is descended from gods, and not in a metaphorical divine right way, but literally. If the gods married their siblings to maintain cosmic order, then obviously the royal family should do the same. Because nothing says eternal stability like awkward family reunions that double as wedding receptions. This wasn't about attraction. It was about power consolidation. Pharaohs didn't want outsiders, even noble ones, gaining access to the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the assets in-house. Essentially, royal Egypt ran on a combination of divine mythology and dynastic trust issues. Some of the most famous pharaohs followed this tradition. Tutankhamun, for example, was born from a brother-sister union, a fact confirmed by modern DNA analysis. And spoiler alert, it didn't turn out great. Tut had numerous congenital issues, including a clubfoot and a fragile immune system, which might suggest that repeating the family tree too many times comes with consequences. Meanwhile, commoners were not partaking in this trend. Most regular Egyptians married outside their immediate families like sane, functioning people. Cousin marriage occasionally happened in rural areas, but brother-sister unions were strictly for the folks with gold masks and burial boats. Even among royals, the practice could cause problems. When Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra, took the throne, she technically married her brothers, plural, as per custom, but she ruled largely alone and later aligned herself with men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who were not, thankfully, related to her. To us, the whole concept seems bizarre, and yes, medically unwise. But to the ancient Egyptian elite, it was simply tradition wrapped in God-complex logic. Divine bloodlines had to stay divine, even if it meant sacrificing variety in the royal gene pool. If you assume all ancient Egyptian art was solemn statues, stiff postures, and endless profile views, you're technically right, unless you've seen the Turin erotic papyrus. Then you realize, oh, they had jokes and very detailed anatomy. While Egyptian art is mostly known for its restraint, stoic pharaohs, serene gods, perfectly symmetrical profile faces, the culture wasn't immune to cheekiness. Sex, after all, wasn't taboo. So occasionally, the artist stopped carving falcons and started sketching something a bit more animated. The most infamous example is that Turin papyrus, now tucked away in an Italian museum like a naughty secret. It's believed to date to around 1150 BCE, and it contains explicit scenes, not vague mythological winks. We're talking graphic illustrations of men and women, including one gentleman balancing acrobatically on amphorae, which is either symbolic or just showing off. Scholars debate whether it was satire, erotica, or a combination of both. Some think it was made to entertain, possibly even a bachelor's gift for someone with questionable taste. Others suggest it was a parody, an artistic prank poking fun at how obsessed people were with fertility, virility, and large wigs. Aside from this outlier, most Egyptian erotic art was symbolic, not explicit. Temples didn't have Kama Sutra frescoes. They had fertility motifs, sacred imagery, and occasional nudes representing rebirth, creation, or divine femininity. Goddesses like Hathor and fertility deities like Min were often shown nude, but in a reverent way. Min, for instance, is always depicted standing tall, if you catch the drift, holding his signature symbol like a divine badge of honor. Then there's the use of humor and sexuality in marginal drawings. Animals behaving like people, exaggerated gestures, and flirty little side sketches on workers' ostraca, limestone flakes used like sticky notes. The ancient equivalent of doodling in your notebook when the foreman wasn't looking. Eroticism in Egyptian art wasn't meant to scandalize. It was simply another part of life, occasionally celebrated, often ritualized, and sometimes hilariously over the top. These weren't repressed people. They just had an excellent sense of boundaries, and occasionally a day where they decided the scroll needed spice. If your idea of ancient love poetry is stiff, chiseled metaphors like, "Your beauty is like a grain silo," think again. The Egyptians may have carved hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but rigid. These people knew how to flirt, with ink, with style, and occasionally with absolutely no chill. Preserved on papyri and broken pottery shards, because nothing says eternal love like a reused cereal bowl, Egyptian love poems date mostly to the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE. And they are refreshingly honest, surprisingly passionate, and occasionally so steamy you'd think they were written during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. Here's a genuine line from one. "I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me, and if you come near me, I will get better." This isn't vague romanticism. This is flirtation with a plan. Both men and women composed these poems, often from a first-person perspective. That's rare for the ancient world. In Egypt, a young woman could describe the thrill of sneaking glances across the lotus pond. A young man could wax poetic about how her voice was better than beer. That's the kind of devotion that deserves a monument. These weren't private diary entries either. Some of them were performed at banquets, read aloud for entertainment, courtship, or just to fill awkward silences between harp solos. Imagine ancient Tinder dates with live readings of passionate stanzas, followed by wine and maybe a goat roast. And the metaphors. Oh, they went all in. Fruit symbolized sensuality. Hunting meant pursuit and seduction. Gardens and rivers were, well, not always about agriculture. These poems weren't afraid to mix earthy, grounded affection with cosmic-level adoration. Desire wasn't something to be repressed. It was to be sung about, written down, and possibly recited by that one cousin who always read too slowly. When you think of aphrodisiacs, you probably imagine oysters, chocolate, or wine, not salad. But in ancient Egypt, if someone brought you a bouquet of lettuce, they weren't thinking about fiber. They were flirting. Specifically, they were invoking the power of Min, the Egyptian god of fertility, who, for reasons that are equal parts symbolic and suspicious, was closely associated with romaine lettuce. Yes, romaine. Not just your average Caesar garnish. This stuff was sacred. The reason? Well, unlike the floppy-leafed varieties we toss in sad lunch bowls today, Egyptian lettuce stood upright and oozed a milky white sap when cut. And if that didn't trigger some highly suggestive divine symbolism, nothing would. Ancient priests looked at that and thought, now that is clearly the embodiment of male potency. Naturally. Lettuce was regularly offered to Min during fertility rituals. His statues typically featured him in a, let's say, alert state, holding his signature attribute in one hand and a lettuce stalk in the other. Art historians have had a field day with that pairing for centuries. At fertility festivals, worshippers would present bundles of lettuce at his temple, hoping to gain his favour for increased virility, a healthy pregnancy, or just a bit of romantic luck. Min was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a dating app algorithm. Worship him correctly, and your chances might improve. Interestingly, there's evidence that the lettuce was also believed to have medicinal properties, particularly for promoting sexual health. Whether it actually worked or just led to fresher breath before a date is debatable, but the symbolism stuck. And this wasn't just a passing trend. Lettuce appears in art, hieroglyphics, and even offerings in tombs, as if to say, please ensure I continue enjoying pleasure in the afterlife, and maybe pack a salad. It's worth noting that the ancient Egyptians were big fans of natural symbolism. From the Nile's life-giving floods to the lotus flower's daily blooming cycle, the physical world mirrored their spiritual beliefs. So when a vegetable starts acting a little extra, you best believe it got promoted to mystical status. When it came to preventing pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians employed methods that were imaginative, herbal, and occasionally alarming. Without access to modern science, they relied on natural substances, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the earliest surviving medical documents, dating to around 1550 BCE. One of the more infamous prescriptions involved crocodile dung. Mixed with honey and sourdough, this concoction was inserted vaginally as a form of barrier contraceptive. While modern readers may recoil, the idea was not entirely without logic. The mixture likely created an acidic or obstructive environment. Whether it was effective is unclear. Whether it was unpleasant is easier to guess. More promising was the use of acacia gum, a plant extract that, as later science confirmed, ferments into lactic acid, a compound that does in fact have spermicidal qualities. Combined with other ingredients like honey and dates, it formed a kind of early pessary. It's one of the few ancient remedies that could arguably pass a very lenient clinical trial. These methods suggest that Egyptian women, who had notable legal and medical agency for the time, took active roles in managing reproduction. The use of these materials would have been common knowledge among midwives, healers, and women within the household. There were also ritual and spiritual approaches. Women might appeal to fertility deities like Isis, Hathor, or Bez, seeking either conception or its delay. Magical amulets and incantations were used alongside practical remedies, blurring the line between medicine and religion, as was typical in most aspects of Egyptian life. In addition to preventing pregnancy, Egyptian medical texts contain instructions for inducing menstruation, treating infertility, and even early pregnancy detection using barley and emmer grains exposed to urine, a method surprisingly accurate in some cases. In the absence of modern tools, these practices reveal a culture deeply invested in understanding and influencing the human body. They lacked microscopes, but not intention. Fertility was a matter of life, death, economics, and divine favour. And while some of their methods may now seem outlandish, the impulse behind them, to plan, to protect, to prepare, is strikingly familiar. In ancient Egypt, virginity wasn't a badge of honor, a social currency, or a fragile family heirloom to be guarded at all costs. In fact, it wasn't really a big deal at all, more like a passing footnote in the grander narrative of life, which mostly revolved around crops, inheritance, and not angering the gods before breakfast. There's no known Egyptian word for virgin in the moralistic, ceremonial sense. The closest you'll find are terms that mean young woman, or uninitiated, which is less purity culture, and more hasn't had the time yet. No torches were lit, no ceremonies performed, and no mothers-in-law inspecting linens like they were looking for counterfeit currency. This wasn't because the Egyptians were scandalous libertines. It's just that they had a far more functional approach to sex. It was seen as part of life, like eating bread or avoiding hippos. Important, yes. Sacred sometimes. But nothing that required a purity certificate stamped by a temple priest. For women, value came from things like fertility, loyalty, and whether she could run a household without the roof catching fire. Her sexual history? Mostly her business. Marriage wasn't about sealing a chaste deal. It was about forming a reliable alliance that could ideally survive tax season and plagues. Of course, modesty existed. People didn't walk around advertising their conquests on papyrus scrolls, but the kind of ritual obsession with virginity found in later societies just didn't materialize here. No cloistering, no dowries based on moral performance, no uncles making awkward speeches about virtue. Even Egyptian religion offered little support for the whole purity panic. The goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and wine, was openly sensual and extremely unbothered by anyone's opinions. The gods were far too busy managing creation and cosmic balance to weigh in on who had done what, when, and with whom. In the end, virginity in ancient Egypt was treated for what it is, a temporary condition, not a lifelong resume. And frankly, they seemed more concerned with who could bake good bread and whether your father had a reliable roof to offer. Because when you live in a desert surrounded by crocodiles, you learn pretty quickly what really matters, and what absolutely doesn't. Ancient Egyptian society didn't publish rainbow flags or hold parades, but it also didn't seem particularly troubled by the existence of same-sex relationships. There were no official laws condemning them, no public stonings, and, most tellingly, no frenzied temple sermons about the end of civilization brought on by two men sharing a bedroll. In short, they noticed, but didn't panic. The most discussed example is that of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, two high-ranking officials buried together in a shared tomb at Saqqara. Their tomb features intimate artwork, the pair embracing, touching noses, a gesture equivalent to a kiss, and generally behaving like a couple whose biggest argument was probably about linen colours. The inscriptions refer to them as overseers of the manicurists, which sounds innocuous until you realise they were clearly close enough to be buried as one household unit. Were they lovers? Roommates with exceptional boundaries? Brothers unusually fond of holding hands? Scholars still debate, but the visual language leans heavily in favour of a romantic, or at least deeply affectionate bond. And the fact that their tomb exists, beautifully decorated, publicly visible, suggests that nobody was outraged. They were important, respected, and apparently allowed to be themselves, even in death. Egyptian texts and mythology also leave space for fluidity. Some deities, like Hapi, god of the Nile, are depicted as intersex or androgynous. Others take on dual roles or switch genders in mythological tales without causing divine HR complaints. The gods, it seems, were not limited by human categories, and neither were the people invoking them. That said, there's no evidence of organised same-sex marriages or political recognition of same-gender unions. Egyptians were pragmatic. If a relationship produced heirs and property stability, great. If it didn't, well, that was your household's business. Intimacy, as always, was treated with a curious mix of privacy and normalcy. And while male same-sex relations are more visible in the records, female ones are almost completely absent, not because they didn't happen, but because Egyptian scribes had a frustrating habit of ignoring what women did when no men were around. In ancient Egypt, having children wasn't just desirable. It was a social expectation, a spiritual duty, and, if you were lucky, a way to ensure someone would refill your tomb offerings long after you were gone. So when a couple struggled to conceive, it wasn't brushed aside. It was investigated, medically, magically, and sometimes both in the same afternoon. The ancient Egyptians approached infertility with characteristic pragmatism. Their medical papyri, particularly the Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, include detailed diagnoses, treatments, and methods for evaluating female fertility. There were instructions for examining cervical mucus, monitoring cycles, and even a primitive pregnancy test involving urinating on barley and emmer wheat. If the grains sprouted, congratulations, your household was about to get louder. If not, the next step might involve inserting herbal mixtures, fumigating the womb, yes really, or appealing to higher powers. Because in Egypt, if medicine didn't work, magic was always available and often recommended. Amulets played a central role. Symbols of Hathor, Isis, Bez, or Taweret, the hippo-shaped protector of childbirth, were worn, carried, or placed under pillows. Spells were recited. Figurines were buried or cradled. One text suggests that to conceive, a woman should drink a concoction of ground dates, honey and carob while reciting a protective charm. Not FDA approved, but deeply heartfelt. Men, of course, weren't off the hook, though far fewer papyri bother to question their reproductive contributions. In cases of persistent infertility, a man might be told to undergo purification rituals, consult a priest, or, in less official advice, simply try harder. And because this was Egypt, cosmic order, Ma'at, was always part of the equation. A childless couple might be seen as unbalanced, or even cursed. But society didn't shun them. It offered remedies, hope, and a few very creative prescriptions. It's worth noting that despite all this effort, Egyptian households weren't necessarily overflowing with children. High infant mortality, disease, and malnutrition kept family sizes smaller than ideal, which only made fertility all the more sacred, and its absence all the more personal. If you think desire fades after death, the ancient Egyptians would like a word, and possibly a carefully carved offering slab. In their worldview, death wasn't an end. It was a continuation of life, ideally with all the comforts, pleasures, and daily routines of the living world, including sex. Funerary texts, tomb inscriptions, and grave goods all suggest that the deceased hoped to carry their appetites into the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but for love, touch, and intimacy. Because frankly, what's the point of eternal life if it doesn't include a bit of pleasure? Tomb art often depicted couples embracing, holding hands, or standing intimately close, not just for sentiment, but as a spiritual blueprint. These weren't generic stock poses, they were deliberate messages to the gods. Please restore our bodies, our love, and, if possible, our bedroom privileges. And yes, bodily restoration was a serious concern. In the Book of the Dead and other mortuary texts, the dead are promised their limbs will function, their hearts will be weighed fairly, and their, let's say, equipment will be returned intact. There are even references to revivifying certain parts of the anatomy. No detail was considered too personal for eternity. Sexuality was tied to rebirth. The god Osiris, famously dismembered and reassembled by Isis, was revived, including a reconstructed phallus, before fathering Horus. This myth wasn't just legend, it was a template. If the gods resumed intimacy after resurrection, so should the rest of us. Some tomb inscriptions even included requests to the gods for continued love between husband and wife. in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. It was envisioned as a lush, idealized version of earthly life. Fertile land, calm waters, eternal abundance, and, evidently, room for romance. While modern cultures often compartmentalize sex as earthly and mortal, the Egyptians folded it seamlessly into their afterlife ideology. It wasn't shameful or forgotten. It was another part of the soul's well-being, like food, music, and not having to pay taxes ever again. In the end, they hoped for what most people still do: comfort, companionship, and a little joy, even if it took mummification and a few magical scrolls to get there. When we peel back the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt, metaphorically of course, what we find is a civilization that didn't treat the human body as something shameful, sinful, or suspicious. It was seen as natural, powerful, and capable of both divine creation and very human desire. Sex, for the Egyptians, was not a secret to be hidden. It was a fact of life, discussed in poems, depicted in art, sometimes vividly, and written into the very myths that shaped their worldview. Gods themselves fell in love, flirted, seduced, and occasionally caused fertility-related chaos across the Nile. In a culture where existence flowed from cycles, the flooding of the river, the return of the sun, the rebirth of the soul, sexuality was part of that rhythm, not an interruption of it. They also took a practical approach. From contraception and fertility treatments to love songs and afterlife desires, the Egyptians faced physicality head-on, often with more clarity than many societies that came centuries later. There was no hysterical legislation, no moral panic, no need for uncomfortable censorship scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. Just a clear understanding. Bodies do things, people feel things, and the world keeps turning. Importantly, they didn't overthink it. Sex wasn't put on a pedestal, nor was it dragged through the mud. It was part of health, love, family, and sometimes religion, worthy of respect, but not surrounded by neurosis. Even their gods, powerful and eternal, didn't shy away from physical form or intimacy. In fact, they embodied it. And while not every practice holds up today, we're looking at you, crocodile dung, the attitude remains refreshingly modern. Or perhaps modernity has just taken 3,000 years to catch up. And maybe that's the legacy worth remembering. A culture that didn't fear the body, didn't vilify desire, and somehow still managed to build pyramids on top of it all. It was August 24th, 1814, and Washington, D.C. was burning. Columns of smoke choked the night sky as British soldiers torched the most symbolic buildings in the young republic: the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Office, and the President's Mansion, later to be called the White House. Flames licked the rooftops as the redcoats walked through the city almost casually, facing no organized resistance. The Capitol, barely a teenager in political years, was defenseless. The humiliation was complete. The world watched in disbelief, and America blushed with shame. But to understand how things got this bad, you have to rewind a bit. 2 years earlier, the United States had declared war on Great Britain, filled with confidence and grand delusions. The Americans thought the war would be swift and glorious, that they'd invade Canada, defeat the British, and finally earn global respect. After all, Britain was already exhausted fighting Napoleon in Europe. Surely they wouldn't have the energy to bother with a scrappy ex-colony acting tough. They were wrong. Not only did the invasion of Canada fail miserably, but the US Navy's few successes couldn't make up for repeated land defeats. Political divisions inside America made matters worse. Some states didn't want the war at all. Supplies were short, strategy was confused, and worst of all, the British never forgot. By 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and Britain had a clear calendar. With veteran troops now available, they turned their full attention across the Atlantic. And they were ready to send a message, one that would sear itself into the American psyche for generations. Washington, D.C. wasn't just targeted for military reasons, it was symbolic, the seat of power, the pride of the Republic. And on that humid August day, it was left almost completely undefended, because no one really believed the British would dare strike it directly. The irony: they didn't just dare, they planned it down to the minute. What unfolded wasn't a battle, it was a torchlit parade of revenge, a reminder that the British Empire, despite the revolution, still had the power to humiliate its former colonies. And as the flames engulfed the House of Representatives and smoke blackened the dome of the Capitol, America had to ask itself a painful question. Had they underestimated the empire they once defied? The British didn't just appear in Washington by magic. Their road to the Capitol was shockingly easy, because the Americans practically opened the door for them. Their landing point was Benedict, Maryland, a sleepy town on the Patuxent River. From there, seasoned British Major General Robert Ross led roughly 4,500 troops, many of them veterans fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, on a march toward Washington. And it wasn't a desperate push through enemy territory. No, it was more like a Sunday hike. Why? Because the Americans barely tried to stop them. President James Madison and his government knew the British were coming. They had time. Warnings had come from scouts and even civilians. But bureaucracy, indecision, and just plain wishful thinking led to a sluggish and chaotic defense. Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr., in a moment of genius-level denial, insisted the British wouldn't dare attack Washington. "They'll go for Baltimore," he claimed, repeatedly. Spoiler, they didn't. Brigadier General William Winder was the man in charge of stopping the British advance. Unfortunately, Winder was better at writing reports than leading troops. His hastily assembled defence force consisted of militiamen, many untrained, undisciplined, and some reportedly drunk. The professional soldiers he had were too few. Worse, Winder hesitated. He kept pulling back instead of digging in, unsure where the British would strike. The two forces finally met on August 24th at the Battle of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. American forces outnumbered the British, but that didn't matter. The battle was a total fiasco. Militiamen broke ranks and fled before firing a shot. Some simply dropped their weapons and ran. President Madison himself was on the field briefly, then wisely decided to not die with the amateurs. The British, stunned by the ease of victory, pressed forward. No trenches to overcome, no burning barricades, no desperate defence of the capital. Just a straight shot into the city. It was a comedy of errors, but no one was laughing. By the time the British reached Washington, American leadership had dissolved into chaos. Madison fled. Government documents were being stuffed into carts. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to abandon the White House without dignity, packed up valuables, including Gilbert Stuart's now famous portrait of George Washington. As night fell, the Redcoats marched in, and the match was almost ready to be lit. By the time the British entered Washington, the city was nearly deserted. Politicians had fled. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The only sounds were the boots of British soldiers and the soft crackle of fires already smouldering from earlier skirmishes. Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn led their men with clinical precision. No looting, no chaos, just a disciplined mission to make a statement. And what a statement it was. The British troops began with the Capitol building. It was still under construction, but the north and south wings, the chambers of Congress, were complete enough to symbolize the pride and function of the American government. The British set fire to both wings. Flames engulfed the Library of Congress. The books and manuscripts, some irreplaceable, went up in smoke. It wasn't just a military blow. It was a cultural one. Next, they moved to the White House, then known as the President's Mansion. Dolly Madison had already fled, but not before rescuing that now iconic portrait of George Washington. British troops found the building empty, but dinner was laid out on the table, untouched. In what might be history's most awkward meal, British officers sat down and enjoyed the president's dinner before torching the place. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial, in the destruction. Cockburn, who had a personal score to settle with the Americans for mocking him in political cartoons, reportedly made a point of burning the offices of anti-British newspapers, and even stood atop the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives, declaring mockingly, "Shall this harbour of Yankee democracy be burned? Oh yes, it shall." Over the course of 2 days, building after building was put to the torch. The Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, the Arsenal. Even the bridge across the Potomac was burned to prevent counterattacks. Yet despite the thoroughness, some sites were spared. The Patent Office, for instance, was saved because one brave American, William Thornton, convinced the British that it served all mankind, not just the US government. The destruction wasn't random. It was surgical, and it was meant to humiliate. The British weren't trying to conquer Washington. They were trying to shame it. And with each building that collapsed in flames, their message grew louder. This wasn't just a raid. It was a punishment, and the smoke would linger far beyond the ashes. Just as the British settled into their fiery conquest of Washington, something strange happened. The sky darkened. Winds picked up. Then came the thunder. A violent, freakish storm, what some later called a hurricane, slammed into the capital. It was as if nature herself had decided the city had suffered enough. Torrential rain poured down, extinguishing many of the fires the British had set. High winds tore roofs off buildings, and even lifted cannons off the ground. A British soldier was reportedly crushed by flying debris. The storm grew so intense that British officers began to fear it was a divine judgment, a punishment for burning a defenceless city. And then, almost prophetically, a tornado ripped through the heart of DC. Yes, a literal tornado. It tore through the centre of town, flinging carts and debris like matchsticks. Buildings collapsed, trees snapped in half, and British soldiers were thrown to the ground, confused and shaken. The British command, already preparing to leave, took this as a clear sign. Their message had been delivered. To stay longer might be tempting fate. They pulled out of the city the next day, their mission complete and their boots barely dry. For Washington, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, it caused even more destruction, ripping apart already damaged structures and flooding the streets. On the other hand, it helped extinguish the flames and may have prevented the complete destruction of the city. It quite literally washed away the British presence. In the minds of many Americans, this storm took on near mythical status. Clergy declared it an act of divine intervention. Editorials praised the hand of providence. Even hardened soldiers whispered that God had stepped in to protect the capital when man had failed to do so. Of course, nature doesn't take sides. The storm didn't rebuild the city or restore lost lives, but symbolically, it marked a turning point. The fires were out, the British were gone, and what remained, smoking ruins, wet ash, shattered pride, was still American. The storm became a strange kind of salvation. In the absence of military strength, Washington had been spared by something else, something uncontrollable, unpredictable, and perhaps, in its own way, redemptive. The worst was over, but rebuilding the soul of a nation? That was just beginning. The British had left, the fires were out, the storm had passed. But what they left behind wasn't just ash and rubble, it was psychological devastation. Washington, D.C. lay in ruin. The capital was a blackened shell. The president's mansion was little more than a scorched frame. Government offices were gutted, their contents scattered or destroyed. For many Americans, especially those in the capital, the destruction felt like a second revolution. Except this time, it was the enemy who marched through triumphantly. The nation faced a haunting question. Should Washington remain the capital? Many believed it was over. The argument seemed logical. Washington had always been a compromise, built in a swampy patch of nowhere to appease southern states. Now, after being embarrassed and burned to the ground, it looked like a failed experiment. Some in Congress pushed for relocation. Philadelphia, New York, or even Baltimore could serve better. Cities with actual defences, cities with dignity intact. but others pushed back. Among them was a determined President James Madison. Despite fleeing the city during the attack, he returned quickly, vowing not to let the humiliation stand. He was joined by his wife, Dolly, who had become a symbol of grace under fire for her rescue of national treasures. Together, they insisted that the city would rise again. Rebuilding was slow. Funds were tight. Morale was worse. Congress convened in temporary quarters, first at the Patent Office, then later in a makeshift brick building known as the Old Brick Capitol. Every session reminded lawmakers of what had been lost, but the burning of Washington had sparked something unexpected. Resolve. Ordinary citizens, craftsmen and labourers joined in efforts to restore the city. Brick by brick, the Capitol rose again. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe returned to oversee the restoration. His designs included improvements, stronger materials, grander visions. The president's mansion too was rebuilt, eventually being whitewashed to hide the burn marks. That's how it earned its now famous nickname, the White House. Rather than being abandoned, Washington became a symbol of American tenacity, a reminder that even in the face of utter humiliation, a republic could endure and rebuild. And while scars remained, both visible and emotional, they hardened into resolve. Washington wasn't going anywhere, because the true capital of a nation isn't just in buildings, it's in belief. The burning of Washington wasn't just a blow to architecture, it was a blow to the national ego. Up until that moment, many Americans had viewed the War of 1812 as a misguided sideshow, a political miscalculation wrapped in patriotic noise. But when British troops torched the heart of the Republic, the country snapped awake. Panic gripped citizens up and down the East Coast. If the capital could fall so easily, what city was safe? Baltimore? Philadelphia? Even New York? Suddenly the war felt very real, very close, and very dangerous. Public opinion, once divided, began to harden. The old Federalist arguments that the war was unnecessary and poorly managed began to seem almost treasonous. Even critics of President Madison now had to admit that the time for squabbling was over. The country had been slapped across the face and it needed to respond. Militias were called up, local defences were reinforced. Baltimore, in particular, braced for what many assumed would be the next British target. Citizens dug trenches, built fortifications, and readied their harbour guns. The British had lit a fire, not just in the buildings of Washington, but in the hearts of Americans. But it wasn't just fear that spread, it was defiance. Newspapers printed fiery editorials calling for revenge. Preachers thundered from pulpits about divine justice. Artists created stirring images of Dolly Madison and burning buildings, turning catastrophe into a kind of folk heroism. Out of the ashes, a story began to form, not of defeat, but of resilience. It was a strange transformation. The loss of the capital could have crushed morale, but instead, it ignited a nationwide sense of unity. There was shame, yes, but also a desire to prove that the United States was not just a flimsy experiment in democracy, that it could take a punch and still stand. President Madison, once a cautious and often unpopular leader, began to grow in stature. He had stood by his ruined capital, vowing to rebuild, and that image, of a battered but resolute republic, resonated deeply. The British had hoped to humiliate. Instead, they galvanized. The war wasn't over, but America had finally begun fighting it not just with muskets, but with meaning. If Washington was the slap, Baltimore was the punchback. Just weeks after burning the capital, British forces set their sights on Baltimore, a major port city and home to privateers who had been harassing British shipping. Confident after their success in Washington, the British assumed Baltimore would fall just as easily. They were wrong. By the time the Redcoats approached in mid-September 1814, Baltimore was ready. Local citizens, labourers, and even enslaved people had worked day and night to fortify the city. More than 10,000 volunteers dug trenches, built earthen walls, and armed Fort McHenry with heavy cannons. This wasn't going to be another walkover. The British strategy was a classic two-pronged assault, a land attack from the east and a naval bombardment from the Patapsco River. But from the beginning, things went sideways. General Robert Ross, the same man who had marched triumphantly into Washington, was killed early in the land battle by American sharpshooters. His death dealt a blow to British morale and left their command structure scrambling. Meanwhile, at sea, the British fleet began a 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry. Rockets streaked across the sky. Bombs exploded over the fort all night long. But the defenders held firm. They refused to surrender, even as the fort trembled under fire. And then came the morning of September 14th. As the smoke cleared and silence returned to the harbour, the British expected to see a white flag. Instead, they saw something else. A massive American flag flying defiantly over the fort's ramparts. That flag, stitched by Mary Pickersgill, was 30 feet tall, waving in the morning breeze like a middle finger to empire. On a British ship, watching all of this, was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He had come to negotiate a prisoner release, but what he saw that night inspired him to scribble down a poem. Its opening line? "Oh say, can you see, by the dawn's early light?" The British realised Baltimore would not fall. They withdrew, humiliated. This time, it was American resilience on display, not in speeches, but in grit, trenches, and a stubborn refusal to yield. Baltimore had survived, and in doing so, it reignited belief in the American cause. A burned capital had sparked the fight, but a bombarded fort lit the flame of identity. After Baltimore, everything changed. The United States had gone from being embarrassed on the world stage to suddenly holding its ground. The British, expecting a quick end to the war with a decisive blow in Washington, now faced growing resistance and fewer wins. Their war machine was slowing. Logistically stretched and politically pressured, they began to rethink the costs of dragging the conflict on. Baltimore's defense wasn't just a military win, it was a psychological one. It gave American negotiators something to stand on. And in the quiet city of Ghent, in what's now Belgium, talks between British and American diplomats entered a new phase. At first, British demands were steep. They wanted a Native American buffer state in the Midwest, control over parts of the Great Lakes, and even certain territorial concessions. But American diplomats, especially John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, refused to bend. They argued from a position of resilience, not desperation. And then the British started to blink. The war in Europe had drained them. Post-Napoleonic Britain had its own domestic unrest to manage. Trade disruptions were hurting both economies. The American refusal to surrender after Washington and their successful defense of Baltimore had shifted perception. This war, it turned out, couldn't be won with fire alone. By December 24, 1814, both sides reached an agreement, the Treaty of Ghent. It essentially declared a draw. No land changed hands, no reparations were paid. Impressment, one of the key reasons the US had gone to war, wasn't even addressed. But neither side wanted to admit defeat, so they agreed to return to the status quo antebellum, things as they had been before the war. And in a strange twist of history, one of the most decisive American victories, the Battle of New Orleans, happened 2 weeks after the treaty was signed, thanks to the slowness of 19th century communication. But that win sealed the emotional victory Americans needed. The war ended not with a dramatic surrender, but with a mutual shrug. Still, for the United States, it felt like something more. They had survived the burning of their capital, rallied at Baltimore, and walked away with their sovereignty and pride intact. And just like that, the Second War of Independence, as some would call it, came to a close. The embers of Washington were still warm. But from those ashes, a new kind of American identity was beginning to form. The burning of Washington was more than a war tactic. It became a defining national trauma. Yet in the strange way history often works, that moment of utter disgrace gave birth to something quietly powerful: identity. In the immediate aftermath, Americans had every reason to feel defeated. Their capital was reduced to smouldering rubble. Their president had fled. Their army had collapsed in battle. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. Out of that destruction came a collective refusal to be defined by loss. The reconstruction of Washington wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about defiance, memory, and renewal. The new Capitol and White House would become architectural symbols of national endurance. The very act of rebuilding was a political message to the world. We're still here. And it worked. The war may have ended in a stalemate on paper, but in the American imagination, it became something else entirely. The idea that a young, disorganized republic could take on the world's greatest empire, get burned, battered, but never broken, began to solidify a sense of exceptionalism. The War of 1812, and particularly the burning of its capital, marked a kind of coming-of-age moment for the United States. It also forced change. The government took defence more seriously. Fortifications were improved along the coasts. The military, long neglected since the Revolution, began receiving better funding and more strategic organisation. Civilians too saw themselves differently, not as scattered citizens of states, but as participants in a shared national experiment. Culturally, the flames left a mark. Francis Scott Key's poem, inspired by the defence of Baltimore, would become the national anthem more than a century later. The term White House, born from the post-fire renovation, became permanent. Dolly Madison's bravery became a legend, and the city that once seemed like a failed compromise became the unquestioned heart of the nation. Even the British, in time, came to treat the event with a sort of embarrassed quiet. They had succeeded militarily, but arguably failed diplomatically. Their fire may have burned the walls, but not the will. In the end, the burning of Washington wasn't just a low point. It was the spark that tested and proved the durability of a republic still learning how to stand. And that fire, once meant to humiliate, helped forge the American spirit in flame. In medieval Europe, the journey into motherhood often began before a girl had fully left childhood. A girl's value, status, and even salvation were often wrapped up in her ability to bear children, especially sons. While today we might think of motherhood as a personal choice or biological event, in the Middle Ages it was a societal obligation. Women weren't just expected to become mothers, they were destined for it. Marriage was the first step. Among peasants, it might be arranged by families eager to merge land, labour, or livestock. Among the nobility, marriage was a political chess move. A noble girl might be married off by age 12 or 13, sometimes even younger in betrothal, her body pledged to a future alliance. Fertility wasn't just a blessing. It was a bargaining chip. Once married, the pressure to conceive began immediately. A wife who failed to become pregnant after a year or two was whispered about, suspected, pitied, sometimes even accused of moral or spiritual failing. If a noblewoman failed to produce an heir, her husband might seek annulment, or worse, take a mistress more capable. Among the nobility, a woman's womb was a national asset. Kingdoms rose or fell based on whether a queen could produce a healthy male heir. Pregnancy was met not just with celebration, but anxiety. The stakes were high. A male child might mean the continuation of a dynasty. A daughter? Not useless, but certainly not ideal. Peasant women, meanwhile, had less dynastic pressure, but not less expectation. Children meant labourers. A growing family could support the farm, tend livestock, and maybe, just maybe, help the parents in old age. But with high infant mortality and no understanding of maternal health, every pregnancy was a gamble. Motherhood wasn't considered a choice. It was an expectation, a calling, even a form of penance. The Church taught that Eve's sin condemned women to the pain of childbirth, and so motherhood became both duty and punishment. Women were praised for suffering in silence, for embracing their role without complaint. In the medieval mindset, a woman who didn't bear children was a curiosity at best, a failure at worst. The womb wasn't private. It was public property, divine machinery, and dynastic infrastructure all in one. And for most women, it would define not just their lives, but their deaths. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a battlefield, and the woman giving birth was often the lone soldier. There were no doctors in white coats, no sterile instruments, and certainly no painkillers. Instead, there were dimly lit rooms, wooden stools, herbal tinctures, whispered prayers, and an ever-present fear that this birth might be her last. Labour usually took place at home. Rich or poor, most women gave birth surrounded by other women. Midwives, female relatives, neighbours. Men were rarely present. In fact, childbirth was considered a deeply female domain, both sacred and dangerous. A midwife might have some knowledge passed down through generations, but she had no formal training. And if something went wrong, if the baby was breech, if labour stalled, if there was hemorrhaging, there was little anyone could do. Pain was expected. In fact, it was theologically required. The Church taught that Eve's original sin had cursed women to suffer in childbirth, so enduring that pain was often seen as spiritually virtuous. Crying out too loudly? That might be interpreted as weakness, or worse, sin. Some tried to ease the suffering. Herbal concoctions made from poppy, mandrake, or henbane might dull the edge of the agony, but they were unreliable and sometimes dangerous. More often, women relied on saints, charms, and ritual. The girdle of St. Margaret was a popular talisman, wrapped around a labouring woman's belly to protect her and the child. Holy relics were placed under beds. Psalms were chanted. Midwives crossed themselves before cutting the umbilical cord. And yet, death hovered. Maternal mortality was tragically common. Women could die from blood loss, infection, or retained placenta days after giving birth. Some survived the labour only to succumb to puerperal fever later. What we now know was often caused by unwashed hands or dirty linens. It's estimated that 1 in 10 births ended with the death of the mother. For poor women with multiple pregnancies, the odds only worsened. Stillbirths, too, were frequent. Babies born too early, too small, or too still. And when a child died unbaptized, it raised terrifying questions about their soul. In this world, childbirth wasn't just biology, it was peril, prayer, and penance, and every new life came at the edge of death's door. Bringing a child into the world was only the beginning. The real struggle, for both mother and child, was survival. In the Middle Ages, the odds were merciless. Nearly half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Some never took their first breath. Others succumbed to illness before they could even walk. A child's first year was the most dangerous. Fevers, infections, and malnutrition were ruthless killers, and medical understanding was virtually non-existent. Peasant mothers bore the brunt of this reality. Living in cramped homes with dirt floors, surrounded by animals, and drinking water from contaminated wells, they fought a daily war against disease. Diarrhea, respiratory infections, and tetanus were common causes of death. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and certainly no hospitals. Even a mild fever could spiral into tragedy. Noble women had cleaner surroundings and better access to food, but they were not immune. Disease didn't care about titles. Plague, smallpox, measles. They took royal and commoner alike. In fact, high birth rates among the nobility weren't just about producing heirs. They were about statistical survival. Having one son wasn't enough. You needed backups. This brutal reality shaped how mothers viewed their children, especially in the early years. It wasn't uncommon for parents to delay naming a child until they passed infancy. Some mothers resisted forming strong attachments right away, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. Grief was a familiar visitor. To bury one child was tragedy. To bury several was routine. Yet love still existed. Fierce, aching, desperate love. We see it in letters, in wills, in prayers scrawled in the margins of manuscripts. We see it in the way mothers would walk miles to find healing herbs or bring a priest for a deathbed baptism. They didn't just mourn their children. They fought for them, with everything they had. The emotional toll was enormous. There were no therapists, no mourning leave, no grief counsellors. A mother might lose a baby on Monday and return to her chores on Tuesday. The fields needed ploughing. The fire needed stoking. Life moved forward, whether your heart was ready or not. In medieval motherhood, hope and heartbreak lived side by side. Every birth was a miracle. Every survival, a small defiance against the crushing odds. For noble women, motherhood wasn't just personal, it was political. A noble woman's womb was an asset of the crown, a vessel for alliances, dynasties, and succession plans. Her pregnancies were tracked with more intensity than most medieval wars. And every child, especially a son, was a strategic victory, or a public failure. The pressure was immense. From the moment of marriage, a noble woman's sole duty was to produce heirs. Not just any children, legitimate, healthy, male children. A queen who failed to do so risked being cast aside. Kings might seek annulments, mistresses, or even new wives altogether. Just ask Anne of Bohemia or Catherine of Aragon. A barren noblewoman wasn't just pitied, she was politically useless. Even when children were born, the mother's work wasn't done. Her role became one of anxious oversight. She didn't necessarily raise the children herself. Wet nurses, governesses, and tutors were typically responsible for daily care. But she was expected to manage their education, secure their futures, and guard their reputations like a hawk. Mothers of future kings often endured endless court gossip, factional intrigue, and manipulation. Their sons were pawns before they could walk, betrothed before they could speak. And daughters? They were marriage chips, often sent to foreign courts as teenagers, sometimes never to return. Still, noble mothers weren't always distant or decorative. Some wielded enormous influence through their children. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just birth kings, she advised them, corrected them, and in one case rebelled against one. Margaret of Anjou led armies to defend her son's throne. Isabella of France orchestrated the deposition of her husband in her son's name. These were not passive mothers. These were political operatives disguised in velvet and lace. Motherhood also came with heartbreak, stillbirths, disease, assassinations, and exile. Royal children were far from safe. The higher the rank, the deadlier the game. Emotionally, noble mothers lived in constant tension. They had status, but not always agency. Love for their children was real, but often tangled with duty. They were expected to sacrifice their bodies, their privacy, and even their maternal instincts for the good of their house. If noble women bore the weight of dynasties, peasant mothers carried the full burden of survival, raw, relentless, and unromantic. For the medieval peasant woman, motherhood wasn't a stage of life, it was life itself. It began young, ended late, and rarely offered rest in between. These women typically married in their mid-teens and were pregnant almost constantly through their 20s and 30s. With no access to reliable birth control, and with the church staunchly condemning any form of contraception, pregnancy was a near-constant state. Each child born was another mouth to feed, but also, potentially, another pair of hands to work the land. Peasant women gave birth at home. No doctors, no clean linens, and no privacy. A neighbour midwife might assist, or not. Some women gave birth alone in barns or fields, returned to labouring within hours, and hoped not to bleed out under the sky. Death during or after childbirth wasn't uncommon, and no one issued apologies for it. Life was cruel, fast, and unsentimental. Child-rearing began the moment the umbilical cord was cut. There was no such thing as maternity leave. Infants were swaddled tightly and either carried on the mother's body while she worked, or left in cradles near hearth fires, supervised by older siblings or none at all. Crying wasn't coddled. It was a sound absorbed into the rhythm of daily toil. Mothers taught their children by example, how to feed chickens, gather firewood, weed gardens, and patch clothes. Even toddlers were expected to fetch water or carry messages. Every child needed to contribute. Childhood, as we think of it, innocent, protected, full of toys and schooling, simply didn't exist. And yet, despite the hardship, there was affection. Mothers sang lullabies, braided their daughters' hair, whispered prayers as they tucked children beside them on shared straw beds. Love was expressed through food, through warmth, through sacrifice. A mother giving her portion of bread to a hungry child, a mother walking barefoot so her son could wear her only pair of shoes to church. Peasant motherhood was a masterclass in endurance. These women carried not just babies, but burdens, firewood, expectations, and loss. Their backs bent with the weight of a world that never paused, even when they buried a child. And still, they kept going. In the medieval world, feeding a baby was a matter of both biology and hierarchy. For most mothers, especially peasants, breastfeeding was non-negotiable. It was natural, expected, and vital for survival. Formula didn't exist, and animal milk was risky and often contaminated. A mother's body was the only lifeline. Peasant mothers breastfed their babies for as long as possible, often well into toddlerhood, because they had to. Breastfeeding not only nourished the child, it also acted as a form of rudimentary birth control, slightly delaying the return of fertility, an accidental mercy in a world of near-constant pregnancies. These women worked the fields with infants strapped to their backs, pausing to feed them between planting and harvesting. But in noble households, the rules changed. For upper-class women, breastfeeding was often considered beneath their station, physically draining, emotionally inconvenient, and culturally unfitting for a lady of refinement. Enter the wet nurse. These were lower-class women, selected for their health and milk supply, who were paid to breastfeed noble infants full-time. They often lived with the child and formed deep maternal bonds, sometimes stronger than the one between mother and child. The Church had mixed feelings about this. Some theologians worried that a child nursed by a morally impure woman might absorb her sins. Others believed wet nurses were a practical necessity for women who needed to remain fertile and continue producing heirs. After all, a queen could not risk wasting time nursing one child when she needed to be pregnant with the next. Infant care itself was harsh by modern standards. Swaddling was nearly universal. Babies were wrapped tightly in cloth to straighten their limbs and train them not to move too much. Diapers existed, but were often reused rags or moss-lined cloth, changed infrequently. Baths were rare. Teething was treated with charms or folk remedies. Cribs were hard, if they existed at all. Babies often shared a bed with their parents, increasing the risk of accidental smothering. Sickness struck quickly. Remedies ranged from herbal infusions to prayers to saints. And if a child died, especially in infancy, some believed it was God's will, or worse, punishment for the mother's sins. Still, mothers did what they could. They rocked, soothed, fed, and sang lullabies in languages long lost. Love found its way, even in the mud and shadows of medieval life. In medieval Europe, motherhood wasn't just physical labour, it was spiritual labour too. The Church had a firm grip on the experience of pregnancy, birth, and parenting. Everything from conception to burial was soaked in religious meaning, and a mother's soul was always under scrutiny. Before childbirth, women often turned to saints for protection. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular among expectant mothers. Legend claimed she could protect them during labour because she herself had once emerged unscathed from the belly of a dragon. Her prayers were recited, her image worn on tokens, her name whispered during contractions. Childbirth, in the eyes of the Church, was tainted by sin. Thanks to the story of Eve, Women were told that pain in labour was punishment for humanity's original fall. So, even in the most joyful moment, the birth of a child, a mother was reminded of her innate guilt. And if she died in childbirth without confession, she risked spiritual peril. Once the baby was born, baptism became the next urgent step. The fear of limbo was real. If a child died before being baptized, many believed their soul would be denied heaven. Midwives were sometimes authorized to perform emergency baptisms if a baby was too sick to wait for a priest. The idea of eternal damnation for a newborn was horrifying, but not uncommon in medieval theology. Superstition filled in where doctrine left gaps. Mothers tied charms to cradles, hung herbs above doorways, or drew protective symbols in ashes on the floor. The evil eye, malevolent fairies, and demonic spirits were all blamed for sickly babies or miscarriages. Some mothers whispered secret names for their children to confuse spirits who might come to steal them away. The church also had control over how women were reintegrated into society after birth. The churching ceremony, usually held about 40 days after delivery, was a kind of ritual purification. Until then, a mother was considered spiritually unclean and was expected to stay out of public worship. The ceremony was meant to bless and welcome her back, but it was also a subtle rebuke. Childbirth, though necessary, left a stain. Despite the harsh theology, many mothers found comfort in faith. Prayer was protection, ritual was reassurance, and hope lived somewhere between the Psalms and the pain. Once a child survived infancy, the next phase of medieval motherhood began, shaping a human who could survive in a brutal world. And this meant discipline, hard truths, and often early separation. For peasant mothers, education wasn't about books. It was about survival skills. From the moment a child could walk, they were expected to contribute. Girls helped gather firewood, feed chickens, and carry water. Boys learned to tend animals, swing tools, and follow behind their fathers in the fields. Mothers were the first teachers, showing their children how to knead dough, spin wool, or patch a worn tunic. The lessons were practical, immediate, and passed down like heirlooms. Discipline was stern, but not necessarily cruel. In a world where disobedience could mean death, a wandering child might drown in a well or be kicked by a horse. Strictness was a form of love. Corporal punishment was common, but so were rewards. A warm meal, a kiss on the forehead, a song by the hearth. Affection and correction often went hand in hand. Among the nobility, education took a different shape. Boys were sent off to train as pages or squires, often before they turned 10. Girls were sometimes placed in convents or noble households to learn etiquette, embroidery, and the finer points of courtly behaviour. For noble mothers, this meant letting go of their children early, sometimes never to raise them at all. That didn't mean they didn't care. Letters from noble women reveal deep concern for their children's health, marriages, and reputations. A noble mother might not tuck her child in every night, but she was often behind the scenes, arranging their futures like a chess master. Still, the emotional toll of separation was real. Children might be raised by strangers, nursed by others, and married off by 15. A mother might hear of her child's death via messenger, or not at all. And yet, medieval mothers found ways to stay connected. Through prayers, through keepsakes, through traditions. They passed down songs, names, and customs, embedding themselves in their children's lives, whether near or far. Medieval motherhood wasn't about holding on. It was about preparing to let go, early, often, and without guarantee. Medieval mothers rarely left written records. They didn't pen diaries or publish books, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in the lullabies that survived, the traditions passed down, the prayers carved into chapel walls, and the bones of the children they raised against all odds. Their love didn't look like ours. There were no baby showers, no ultrasound photos on the wall. Affection was quiet, practical, and often masked by the need to stay emotionally guarded. After all, when so many children died young, to love deeply was to risk devastation. And yet, mothers did love, fiercely, patiently, and without pause. We find traces of that love in the margins of medieval texts, where a woman scribbled her lost child's name beside a prayer. In letters from queens begging for news of their children, in the battered shoes left on graves, in folk tales where mothers trade their lives for their children's safety. These weren't symbols of weakness, they were acts of defiance in a world constantly testing maternal strength. Loss was a constant companion. Stillbirths, fevers, plagues, war. A mother could raise 10 children and bury 6. Mourning was private, often silent, yet carried for a lifetime. Grief wasn't always spoken, but it was never absent. And still they endured. They endured childbirth with no medicine. They endured the shame of barrenness and the pain of losing child after child. They endured the church's scrutiny, society's demands, and their own body's limits. Some endured violence from husbands, others endured exile, poverty, or starvation. But through it all, they nurtured, protected, taught, and, most miraculously, hoped. Their legacy isn't written in stone monuments, but in generations that followed. They are the unnamed ancestors who fed us, clothed us, and somehow made it all work. They built the foundations of family and survival, even when the odds said they shouldn't have. Medieval motherhood wasn't saintly, and it wasn't soft. It was tough, complicated, heartbreaking, and brave. It was sometimes joyful, often tragic, always vital. In every sense, these women were the silent architects of the medieval world, and though history rarely carved their names into its walls, their labour-shaped kingdoms, their choices moulded futures, and their sacrifices echo into us, long after the cradles were emptied and the prayers faded. Long before we ever glimpsed the moons of Jupiter or the rings of Saturn, humanity stared up at the night sky with wonder and very limited tools. In the pre-telescopic world, the cosmos was a vast, unreachable canvas. People tracked stars, plotted planets, and marked the seasons, but they did it all with the naked eye. And that eye, remarkable as it is, has limits. For most of human history, the sky was interpreted more than it was studied. Ancient cultures turned constellations into stories. Orion was a hunter, Scorpio a scorpion sent by the gods. The Greeks named wandering lights planets, wanderers, because they moved differently than fixed stars. But no one really knew what they were. Were they fiery chariots? Crystal spheres? Divine lanterns? No one had any way to look closer and find out. Observation meant standing under the stars and recording what could be seen. Tools like the astrolabe, developed by Islamic astronomers, helped track celestial motion with surprising precision. The Babylonians and Mayans kept meticulous calendars and predicted eclipses. The Greeks built complex mechanical devices, like the Antikythera mechanism, to calculate planetary positions. But no one could see beyond what the eye allowed, and that meant space remained more mystery than reality. The idea of magnifying vision was, at best, a curiosity. People understood reflection, mirrors existed, but refraction, the bending of light through a lens, was still a misunderstood phenomenon. The science of optics was in its infancy, and no one had yet considered applying it to the stars. More importantly, no one imagined that the sky itself could change. The heavens were considered perfect, eternal, and unchanging, Aristotle's realm of divine order. The earth, by contrast, was corrupt and chaotic. This belief held back scientific progress for centuries. Why build a device to examine something you already believed to be flawless? And yet, the need was there, buried in the questions humanity kept asking. What are the stars made of? Why do some lights move and others don't? Is Earth truly at the center of everything? All of those questions floated unanswered above a world that had no way to peer beyond its boundaries. No way, until glassmakers, tinkerers, and one curious Dutchman changed everything. Long before anyone dreamed of peering into the stars, ancient people were already bending light, just not intentionally. In fact, the earliest lenses were likely accidents. Transparent crystals like quartz or beryl could naturally magnify objects when shaped just right. These stones, polished and rounded by hand or nature, would occasionally reveal something curious. Objects looked larger when seen through them. To our ancestors, it must have seemed like magic. By the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians had crafted what we now call the Nimrud lens, a piece of rock crystal possibly used to magnify or focus light. Its exact purpose is debated. Was it part of a scientific tool or just decorative? Regardless, it proves one thing: humans had started to notice that light could be manipulated. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where reading stones appeared, hemispherical pieces of glass placed directly on texts to enlarge the letters beneath. They were the precursors to magnifying glasses and a direct link in the evolutionary chain of optics. These tools didn't explore the sky, but they gave humanity a hint: sight could be enhanced. Yet the real leap came not in Rome, but in the Islamic Golden Age. In the 10th and 11th centuries, a polymath named Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Alhazen, revolutionized the study of light. He wasn't building telescopes, but his work laid down the theory of how they would one day work. Alhazen conducted experiments with glass, mirrors, and water to understand how light travelled and bent. He proposed that vision wasn't sent out from the eyes, as many believed, but rather that light entered the eyes. An insight so obvious today it's hard to believe it was once controversial. His Book of Optics laid out principles of refraction and reflection, defining the science of light centuries before Europe would rediscover it. Though these thinkers never applied their theories to the stars, they built the intellectual scaffolding needed for future inventors. Their writings, once translated into Latin, spread through medieval Europe, setting the stage for the explosive optical experimentation of the Renaissance. By the 13th century, the science of optics had quietly crept into everyday life, not through astronomy, but through a far more personal issue: bad eyesight. In the bustling workshops of Italy, particularly around Venice, glassmakers began crafting lenses to help aging monks and scholars read their manuscripts. The result? Spectacles. The earliest spectacles appeared around 1285, likely in Pisa or Venice. They were simple, convex lenses framed in wood or metal, designed to sit precariously on the nose. There were no temples, no arms to hook behind the ears. Users simply pinched them into place or held them up by hand. But the effect was revolutionary. For the first time, people could fight back against fading vision. The popularity of reading glasses spread fast, especially among clergy and educated elites. Monks could now read scripture well into their later years. Scholars could pore over texts late into the night. Glassmakers had stumbled upon a booming industry, even though they didn't fully understand the physics behind what they were selling. Still, this new obsession with magnification planted an idea in the collective imagination. If glass could help us see the small, could it also help us see the distant? The leap wasn't immediate. For centuries, spectacle making remained a trade focused on individual needs, helping people see books and thread needles. But in the background, knowledge of convex and concave lenses slowly matured. Artisans began playing with lens shapes. Scholars copied and built upon old Arabic texts about refraction. Tinkering became more ambitious. The Renaissance, with its mania for rediscovery and reinvention, poured fuel on this fire. Experimenters began combining lenses, sometimes in play, sometimes in pursuit of genuine innovation. And eventually, someone stumbled upon a configuration that did something unexpected. It brought distant objects closer. That someone, according to most accounts, was Hans Lippershey, a Dutch spectacle maker who, around 1608, assembled a device that could magnify faraway objects. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. His invention, a simple tube with two lenses, was dubbed the spyglass. It had the power to change warfare, navigation, and soon, the cosmos. But Lippershey wouldn't be the one to turn it to the stars. That would take a different kind of mind, part scientist, part showman, and entirely unafraid to challenge the heavens. When news of Hans Lippershey's spyglass reached Italy, one man saw something others didn't, a way to challenge the very fabric of the cosmos. That man was Galileo Galilei, a mathematics professor from Pisa with a flair for experimentation and a deep skepticism toward accepted truths. Upon hearing of the Dutch device in 1609, he didn't just want to copy it, he wanted to improve it. Within months, he built his own telescope, first a 3x magnification, then an 8x, and soon after a 20x. Compared to Lippershey's clunky tool, Galileo's telescope was sharper, longer, and more refined, and then he pointed it at the sky. The moment was historic. Through his handmade lenses, Galileo became the first human to truly see the heavens. What he found shattered the delicate, divine perfection taught by Aristotle and defended by the Church. The moon, for instance, was not a smooth, glowing sphere. Galileo saw craters and mountains, imperfection. The Milky Way wasn't a milky smear, it was made up of countless stars. Jupiter, thought to be just another wandering light, had moons. 4 of them, orbiting the planet like tiny celestial satellites. He named them the Medicean stars, after his patrons, but we know them today as the Galilean moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And most shocking of all, Venus had phases, just like the moon, proving it orbited the sun, not Earth. With each observation, Galileo drove a dagger into the heart of the old geocentric model. The Earth, it seemed, was not the centre of everything. The universe was bigger, stranger, and more dynamic than anyone had imagined. Galileo published his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in 1610. It was a sensation, a celestial tell-all. Crowds gathered to see his telescope. Scholars praised him. The Church grew uneasy. Because this wasn't just a scientific tool anymore. The telescope had become dangerous. It offered evidence that contradicted centuries of theological doctrine. The heavens, once thought immutable and divine, now looked messy, changing, and full of motion. Galileo hadn't just invented astronomy, he had weaponized vision, and with a few polished lenses, he had started a war between observation and belief. The stars would never be safe or silent again. Galileo had proven what 2 lenses in a tube could do, but his Galilean design, one convex lens at the front, one concave at the eyepiece, had limits: a narrow field of view, blurry edges, and paltry magnification once you pushed beyond 30x. Enter Johannes Kepler, the German mathematician already famous for his laws of planetary motion. Reading The Starry Messenger in 1610, Kepler asked a simple question: could the optics be better? Within a year, he produced Dioptris, a treatise that rewrote the rulebook of lenses. Kepler proposed swapping Galileo's concave eyepiece for a second convex lens. The image would flip upside down, but the payoff was huge: a wider field, sharper focus, and theoretically unlimited magnification. Kepler himself never built the device. He spent his life juggling patronage, plague, and family tragedy. But his blueprint spread across Europe like contraband. Tinkerers seized on the idea. In Italy, Francesco Fontana crafted long, unwieldy instruments, some stretching 6 meters, claiming 160x power. In the Netherlands, Christian Huygens and his brother would later push the length past 30 meters to hunt for Saturn's rings. But the first verified Keplerian telescopes appeared in the 1630s, likely built by the Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner. He demonstrated one to the emperor in Vienna, dazzling courtiers with right-angled spies on distant church spires, albeit all upside down. The inverted view was a small price to pay for clarity, yet it created a new market, erecting eyepieces and clever mirror diagonals for land-based viewing. Artisans in Paris and London competed to sell astronomical versus terrestrial models. Telescopes were no longer scientific curiosities. They were luxury items for nobles who wanted to brag about seeing ships before they reached harbour. Meanwhile, Kepler's optics ignited serious science. With clearer images, astronomers could sketch sunspots, map lunar valleys, and time Jupiter's moons so precisely that they proposed using them as celestial clocks for longitude. The telescope was evolving from a disruptive gadget into an indispensable instrument. Yet every added inch of focal length made tubes sag and glass blur. The race was on for shorter telescopes with longer power. That challenge would summon a genius who hated chromatic smears and loved apples. One Isaac Newton. The arms race of vision was far from over. It was only changing shape. By the mid-1600s, the refracting telescope had stretched to absurd proportions. In pursuit of better magnification, astronomers were building scopes longer than houses, some over 100 feet long, just to tame a frustrating flaw: chromatic aberration. This was the rainbow-coloured smudge that bled around bright objects. As light passed through curved lenses, colours split like a prism, creating blurry halos. No matter how carefully a lens was shaped, the colours refused to behave. Enter Isaac Newton, a man who not only understood the problem, but also refused to tolerate it. Newton, already famed for calculus and gravity, turned his razor-sharp intellect to optics. His solution? Stop using lenses altogether. In 1668, Newton introduced something radical: the reflecting telescope. Instead of bending light through glass, he used a curved mirror to collect and focus it. Mirrors didn't split light into rainbows. They didn't need to be hundreds of feet long. And best of all, they could be short, powerful, and precise. Newton's design used a concave primary mirror at the bottom of the tube, which reflected light to a flat diagonal mirror, then into the eyepiece mounted on the side. It looked nothing like Galileo's spyglass, but it worked. The image was crisp, clear, and most importantly, free of colour distortion. At first, Newton kept his invention quiet. He wasn't a fan of public drama, but by 1672 he presented the telescope to the Royal Society, and it caused a stir. Here was a compact instrument with better performance than refractors many times its size. Observers could now study Jupiter's belts, Saturn's rings, and the rugged lunar surface with stunning detail, and from a backyard, not a cathedral rooftop. Still, the reflecting telescope came with its own challenges. Making a perfectly parabolic mirror was difficult. Early versions used polished metal, which tarnished quickly and had to be repolished constantly. But the core idea was revolutionary, and its potential undeniable. Newton's invention didn't replace refractors overnight, but it cracked the telescope wide open. Astronomers now had two competing paths: lenses or mirrors. And as mirror technology improved, Newton's quiet rebellion would reshape the very architecture of astronomy. The universe hadn't changed, but the way we saw it just took a leap forward. By the 18th century, telescopes had escaped the hands of individual tinkerers and entered the age of national pride, royal funding, and scientific ambition. The telescope was no longer just a clever invention. It was now a weapon in the battle to understand the universe. And across Europe, astronomers were wielding it like never before. One name towers above this era: William Herschel. A German-born musician turned self-taught astronomer, Herschel moved to England and became obsessed with the night sky. With the help of his brilliant sister, Caroline Herschel, he began building massive reflecting telescopes in his backyard, melting metal, casting mirrors, grinding lenses by hand. One of his designs reached over 40 feet long, with a 4-foot-wide mirror. It was the largest telescope in the world at the time, and with it, he made history. In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus, the first new planet found since ancient times. It shook the foundations of astronomy. Suddenly, the solar system was bigger than anyone had imagined. Herschel didn't stop there. He charted thousands of stars, catalogued nebulae, and coined the term galaxy. He speculated that some of the fuzzy clouds seen through his telescope might be entire island universes, far beyond our own. Caroline, meanwhile, became a respected astronomer in her own right. She discovered several comets, refined star charts, and published groundbreaking catalogues, working tirelessly beside her brother in the observatory. Elsewhere, the telescope was also helping scientists crack long-standing puzzles. Astronomers used it to track transits of Venus, calculating the Earth's distance from the Sun. Telescopic measurements improved celestial navigation, allowing ships to traverse oceans with far greater precision. Naval empires quite literally depended on the sky. And while Newton's reflectors remained elite instruments, achromatic refractors, which reduced chromatic aberration using special lens combinations, were now commercially available. Opticians like John Dolland refined lenses to sharpen the image without the rainbow smears, offering the best of both worlds, clarity and colour correction. Observatories were being built across Europe, Paris, Berlin, Greenwich. Astronomy became institutionalised. Telescopes sat not just in scholars' attics, but in towers, domes, and royal estates. They had become symbols of enlightenment and empire. This was the golden age of stargazing, when the telescope wasn't just expanding our view, but our very place in the cosmos. As the 19th century dawned, the telescope entered its industrial phase. What began as handmade tubes of brass and glass now became precision-engineered instruments of steel, bronze, and cast iron. The sky, once mapped by candlelight, was now being charted by the rising might of factories, railroads, and empire. The biggest shift? Size. Telescopes were getting enormous. In Ireland, a wealthy astronomer named William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, constructed what was then the largest telescope on Earth. Completed in 1845, the Leviathan of Parsonstown boasted a mirror 6 feet in diameter and a tube 50 feet long. Suspended between two massive masonry walls, it looked more like a siege weapon than a scientific instrument. But it worked. With it, Parsons observed the swirling structure of what was then called the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51, and made one of the first sketches resembling a spiral galaxy. He had no way of knowing how far away it truly was, but the drawing alone hinted that the universe might be full of systems like our own, far beyond the Milky Way. Meanwhile, other observatories sprang up in France, Russia, and America. Astronomers were no longer lone geniuses in cloaks, but salaried researchers with assistants, budgets, and government grants. Telescopes began moving westward, toward drier air, clearer skies, and higher altitudes. One of the most famous was the Lick Observatory in California, built atop Mount Hamilton in 1888. It housed the largest refracting telescope ever constructed, with a 36-inch objective lens. Not to be outdone, the Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin followed in 1897 with an even longer refractor, still the biggest of its kind to this day. But refractors were nearing their limit. Lenses sagged under their own weight. Glass this big couldn't be perfectly cast or supported. The future, once again, pointed to mirrors. Engineers began experimenting with silver-coated glass, lighter and easier to maintain than Newton's old metal mirrors. Reflectors, once overshadowed by their lens-based cousins, were making a comeback. At the same time, photography entered the equation. For the first time, telescopes weren't just for viewing the heavens, they could record them. Astronomers began capturing long-exposure images of stars, nebulae, and planets, seeing deeper than ever before. The age of observation was ending. The age of data had begun. As the 20th century unfolded, the telescope transformed from a tool of vision into a machine of revelation. No longer limited to what the eye could see, telescopes began collecting data across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, unlocking secrets the visible light had always hidden from us. The revolution began atop Mount Wilson in California, where George Ellery Hale spearheaded the creation of the Hooker telescope, completed in 1917. With a 100-inch mirror, it was the most powerful telescope of its time. And into that mirror stared a young astronomer named Edwin Hubble. In the 1920s, Hubble used the hooker to peer into the Andromeda Nebula. What he discovered changed everything. Andromeda wasn't a cloud within our galaxy. It was a galaxy itself. One of millions. Hubble's work demolished the idea of a small, static universe. The cosmos, it turned out, was vast, expanding, and ancient beyond measure. Soon, even the atmosphere became a limitation. Earth's air blurred starlight and blocked much of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, in the latter half of the century, telescopes began climbing higher, into balloons, planes, and eventually orbit. In 1990, NASA launched the Hubble Space Telescope, a namesake tribute orbiting above Earth's distortive atmosphere. After an initial hiccup with its mirror, Hubble went on to deliver the most detailed images of the universe ever captured. Pillars of gas, dying stars, infant galaxies. It stared deeper into time than any human eye ever had, and Hubble was just the beginning. Radio telescopes like those at Arecibo and the Very Large Array in New Mexico allowed scientists to listen to space. Infrared telescopes revealed cool, hidden objects cloaked in cosmic dust. X-ray telescopes detected black holes devouring matter. Each new type of telescope revealed a new layer of the cosmos. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, far more sensitive than Hubble, designed to look back over 13 billion years to the dawn of galaxy formation. Not just an eye in the sky, but a time machine built of gold mirrors and deep mathematics. From Galileo's shaky wooden tube to spacefaring observatories cooled by liquid helium, the telescope has evolved into an instrument of pure awe. We no longer just see the universe, we decode it, and with each new lens, mirror, or frequency unlocked, we inch closer to answering the question that started it all. What else is out there?